Welcome to Owl Stories. Turn off the lights, get in your bed, put on your headphones and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Now, let's dive into the story. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, certain that someone was watching you only to find yourself staring into an empty room? Most people laugh it off, blame it on stress, or tell themselves it was just a dream. But what if the dream wasn't the problem? What if the nightmare begins the moment you open your eyes? This story isn't about monsters in the woods or ghosts in an abandoned house. It's about something much worse, something that doesn't wait for you to go looking for it. Something that waits until you're at your most vulnerable asleep in your own bed. It started like any ordinary move into a new apartment. He was just another young guy, early 20s, steady job, no real baggage to build a life on his own. The place wasn't perfect, but it was cheap, clean, and his. The kind of apartment where you could finally start fresh. For the first few nights, everything seemed normal. He stayed up late on his computer, played some games, watched Netflix, and crashed around midnight. He wasn't a light sleeper, but he wasn't heavy either. Small noise never bothered him much until that Thursday night. It was around 2 in the morning when a faint sound pulled him out of a deep sleep. Not a bang, not a thump, something far subtler. It sounded like fingers dragging slowly across the wall. Not scratching, but tracing, as if someone were outlining the shape of the room with their nails. At first he thought maybe he was dreaming, but the sound moved. It crept along the wall, steady and deliberate, until it stopped just beside the bed. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise itself. He sat up, heart racing, eyes straining in the dark. Nothing, just his desk, the half-open closet, the same shadows that always stretched across the walls. But the sound had been real, too precise to be his imagination. The next morning, he blamed the neighbors. Old buildings carry noise, right, but the neighbors were a retired couple, quiet and polite, who lived on the opposite side of the complex. They had no shared wall with his bedroom. Still, he pushed it aside. Logic was easier than fear. The following night, it happened again. This time, it wasn't the sound that woke him. It was the feeling, weight in the air, the unmistakable sense of being watched. He turned his head slowly toward the corner of the room, and for the briefest moment he saw something. A shape darker than the dark, standing still in the shadows. He blinked and it was gone, but something changed after that night. The room no longer felt like his. It felt occupied, as though he had been the guest all along, and deep down he knew this was only the beginning. The dreams began a week later, not the kind of surreal, nonsensical dreams you forget the second you wake up. Not these felt different. They felt real, too real, as if someone had copied his life and dropped him into a duplicate of his own bedroom. In the first dream, he was lying in bed, in the exact position he'd fallen asleep in. Same blanket, same shadows, same faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Nothing out of place, except he couldn't move. His body felt pinned to the mattress, his chest heavy, as if the very air had thickened into stone. He tried to scream, but his throat locked up, and then came the hand. He felt it slide across his ankle, deliberate. Not a grab, not an attack, just a touch, as if to remind him he wasn't alone. His heart thundered as he strained against the invisible weight, until with a violent gasp, he tore awake. The room was silent. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Sleep paralysis, he told himself, had read about it online. Creepy, yes, but not supernatural. Still, the explanation didn't calm him. It only made him dread going back to sleep. The second dream stripped away even that excuse. This time, he woke to the sound of breathing, not his own. It was quick, shallow, like someone trying not to be noticed. His eyes darted to the foot of the bed. And that's when he saw eat a figure crouched low, almost animal-like. The details were swallowed by the dark, but the outline was unmistakable. When he blinked, it vanished. Panicked, he reached for the lamp, fumbling with trembling hands. The room flooded with light. Nothing there. But the blanket at the foot of the bed had been yanked to the floor in a twisted heap, as though someone had sat there watching him before disappearing. The line between dream and waking blurred after that. Head-wake with the echo of whispers in his ears, words he couldn't quite make out. Sometimes he thought he saw shapes move at the edges of his vision. Other times objects weren't where he left them. High's phone charger unplugged, his desk chair turned slightly, the closet door standing open wider than before. And yet the strangest detail was always the same. Every time the clock read somewhere between 3:00 and 3:30 a.m. He told himself it was coincidence, a trick of the mind, but deep down he knew better. The dreams weren't just dreams. They were warnings, and soon he'd have proof. At first he tried to laugh it off. He told himself it was stress. He was working long hours, barely sleeping, and maybe his brain was just short-circuiting. But then came the evidence he couldn't explain away. One morning he woke up with 3 thin scratches running down his forearm. Not deep enough to bleed, but red and raw, stinging as though they'd been made only minutes before. He stared at them in the bathroom mirror, tracing their path with shaking fingers. They weren't straight, they were curved, almost like someone had carefully dragged a nail across his skin while he slept. The logical part of him whispered, "You did it yourself, in your sleep." But the truth was, the marks were on the inside of his arm, an awkward place for self-inflicted scratches. The next night, something stranger happened. He had set his phone on the nightstand, and before bed, plugged in to charge. When he woke, the phone wasn't there. It was sitting on his desk across the room, flashlight on, battery nearly dead. Confused, he unlocked it, and his blood ran cold. The camera roll was filled with new photos, blurry shapes, tilted angles of the ceiling, corners of the room. A shot of the closet door, slightly ajar, a photo of his desk chair empty, and then the last image, himself. Asleep in bed, he dropped the phone like it burned him. There was no one else in the apartment, no one else who could have taken those pictures. By now, he was terrified to fall asleep, so he started documenting everything. He bought a small notebook and scribbled down dates, times, and details. Every time he woke up from a dream, every strange sound, every item out of place. As the pages filled, a pattern emerged. Almost everything happened between 3:00 and 3:30 a.m., but nothing could have prepared him for what he found next. One night before bed, he set a glass of water on the nightstand. He filled it to the brim just to be sure. When he woke in the morning, the glass was still there, but the water was gone, not spilled, not damp, just empty. The wood beneath it was perfectly dry, as if the water had simply evaporated in the middle of the night. And then came the closet. At first he thought maybe he had left it open a crack, but each morning the door was wider than before. And one morning, inside the closet, he found a pair of shoes he never wore. They had been moved to the center of the floor, perfectly lined up, facing the bed. It wasn't just dreams anymore. It wasn't just his imagination. Something was happening in that room, something intelligent. Something that wanted him to notice, and night by night it was growing bolder. Interlude searching for answers. By this point he was desperate for answers. He stayed up late scrolling through forums, typing frantic searches like dreams that leave real marks and waking up with photos you didn't take. Most replies were dismissive. Stress, sleepwalking, too much caffeine. One person even joked, "Congrats, your apartment's haunted. Move out." But late one night, buried deep in a thread, he found a comment that made his stomach twist. If it only happens between 3 and 3:30, it's not the apartment. It's you, and if that's the case, moving won't help. He closed the laptop and stared into the dark. He didn't know it yet, but those words were the closest thing to the truth anyone would give him, because what came next would prove it beyond a doubt. Sleep became the enemy. Every night was a battle against his own body. He dreaded the hours after midnight, when silence settled over the building and shadows stretched longer across the walls. By the time the clock struck 3, he was either forcing his eyes open in a haze of exhaustion or waking to the same suffocating dread. At first, he tried to fight it with caffeine, coffee, energy drinks, anything that promised alertness. He stacked cans of soda on the kitchen counter, brewed pot after pot of bitter coffee. For a while, it worked. He sat awake on the couch, the TV playing quietly, convincing himself he could outlast whatever it was. But exhaustion always wins. And when it did, he'd slip into the same cycle, eyes closing for a split second, only to wake with his chest pinned down and his skin crawling from a touch that shouldn't have been there. The lack of sleep showed in his face: pale skin, hollow cheeks, dark crescents under his eyes. At work, he lost focus mid-conversation. Colleagues caught him staring into empty corners, as if expecting someone to be there. He mumbled excuses, blamed deadlines and stress, but the truth was far worse. He was terrified of closing his eyes. Friends noticed too. One suggested therapy, another teased him about watching too many horror movies. None of them believed him. How could they? Sleep paralysis, they said. You're just overtired, but bruises don't appear from nothing. Photos don't take themselves. And then came the moments he couldn't even write off as dreams. Late one night, the faint trickle of running water pulled him from half sleep. He stumbled into the bathroom, expecting to find the faucet dripping, but the sink was dry, the mirror, though that was different. It was fogged over, thick with condensation, as if someone had been standing there, breathing heavily just moments before. Another time, while sitting on the couch with every light on, he caught movement in the hallway, just a flicker, like a shadow slipping back out of sight. He told himself it was his imagination. But when he walked to the end of the hall, the air was icy cold, as though someone had been standing there waiting. No matter how many lamps he left on, the dark still found him. By now, fear wasn't his only problem. The lines between waking and dreaming had blurred so badly he no longer trusted his own senses. He began carrying his phone everywhere, flipping to the camera as if proof would protect him. He never caught anything. Just more shadows, more silence, more of that crushing sense of being watched. Finally, he decided he needed undeniable evidence. Something no one could dismiss, not even him. So he set up a camera. He didn't rush into it. The thought of actually capturing something terrified him almost as much as living through it. But after weeks of marks, whispers, and shifting shadows, he knew he couldn't keep doubting himself. So he bought a cheap tripod and set up his old camera, pointing it directly at the bed. He tested it 3 times, checked the angle, adjusted the focus, made sure the red light blinked steadily. He even spoke into the lens: if I move, if anything happens, I want proof. But when it came time to actually lie down, dread washed over him. It wasn't just the thought of what the camera might see. It was the thought that the thing watching him already knew. That by setting up the camera, he was issuing a challenge. Still, he hit record, pulled the blanket up to his chest, and forced his eyes closed. The next morning, he didn't check the footage right away. He let the camera sit there for hours while he paced the apartment, trying to convince himself it would be nothing. A glitch, a blur, something he could laugh at and delete. When he finally pressed play, his hands trembled. The first few hours were uneventful. He was lying still, breathing softly, the rise and fall of his chest steady and calm. Then around 3:12 a.m. the picture flickered. A thin line of static crawled across the frame before clearing again. That's when he saw himself, not lying down anymore, not asleep, sitting upright in bed. The worst part wasn't that he didn't remember moving. It was the way he was sitting rigid, back perfectly straight, arms at his sides. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes wide open, staring directly at the camera. And he didn't blink, not once. For nearly 5 full minutes he sat there, unmoving, unblinking. Then, slowly, he leaned forward until his face filled the frame. His mouth twitched, and then it spread into a grin, not a confused, sleepy smile, not a twitch of a dreamer. A deliberate, slow grin, as if whatever was behind his eyes wanted him to know it was aware of the camera. And then something even worse happened. In the far corner of the frame, the closet door creaked open. Not fast, not jerky, slow, smooth, inch by inch. Inside was nothing but black. But the darkness inside the closet seemed heavier than the rest of the room, almost like it was swallowing the light whole. At 3:17, his body lay back down, pulled the blanket over his chest, closed his eyes, as if nothing had happened. But when he checked the final frame, something new had appeared. On the edge of the mattress, faint but visible, was the outline of a handprint. Long fingers pressed deep into the sheets, right beside where his leg had been. That was the night he stopped sleeping in the bedroom. But the presence didn't care where he went. He abandoned the bedroom after that night, dragged his blankets and pillows to the couch, telling himself if he could just put some distance between him and that room, maybe he'd finally rest. But the thing he hadn't admitted yet, the thing clawing at the back of his mind, was that this wasn't about the room. And he was right. The first night on the couch he woke to footsteps, slow, dragging, circling the living room. His body froze, every nerve screaming to move, but he stayed perfectly still. The steps grew louder until they stopped directly behind him. Then came the whisper, so close he felt warm breath brush his ear. "Wake up." He snapped upright, spinning in place. Nothing, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of the TV screen. But when he looked back at the couch, his stomach twisted into knots. The blanket he'd just thrown off wasn't flat. It was stretched tight, shaped around the outline of a body. His body, a perfect copy of him, lying there as if still asleep. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. He just stared at the duplicate beneath the blanket until, slowly, the shape began to sink. The fabric deflated, flattening back against the cushions, as though whatever had been inside had slipped away. He stumbled back, heart pounding, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the knife he'd started sleeping with. Every light in the apartment blazed. It didn't matter. The dark was no longer confined to corners or closets. It had attached itself to him. From that night on, he stopped trying to fight it. He stopped moving rooms, stopped changing routines. Because deep down, he understood what he hadn't wanted to admit from the beginning. It wasn't the building. It wasn't the furniture. It wasn't even the bed. It was him, and no matter where he went, it would follow. He never broke the lease, never packed his bags. People asked him why, and he could never explain it in a way that made sense. How do you run from something that doesn't belong to a place, but to you? He tried everything, sleeping at hotels, crashing on friends' couches, even staying awake for days at a time. But the pattern always followed. 3 o'clock, the same pressure on his chest, the same voice curling into his ear, the same feeling of eyes opening in the dark when his should have been closed. Some mornings, he'd wake with fresh scratches. Other mornings, he'd find himself standing in front of the mirror, staring into his own reflection, not remembering how he got there. Once, he woke up holding his phone, camera on, recording himself whispering in a language he didn't recognize. Eventually, he stopped trying to convince anyone. He stopped talking about it altogether, because the more he explained, the more insane it sounded. And in some ways, silence was easier. Now, he doesn't wait for it to stop. He just waits for it to show its hand completely. Because whatever it is, it's not done with him. And maybe that's the part that should terrify you most. Because if you ever wake up at 3:17 a.m. with the feeling that someone's standing over you watching, don't open your eyes. Because if you do, you might find that the person staring back is you. What if the ghost haunting a lonely battlefield wasn't a tragic victim, but a man cursed by a lie? For more than a century, locals swore they'd seen him. A soldier sprinting across the fields at twilight, his movements unnatural, his face locked in agony. They called him the runner. Some whispered he was fleeing battle and shame. Others believed he was punished to relive his cowardice for eternity. But when one grieving historian moved into a crumbling cottage at the edge of that same battlefield, he uncovered a truth that changed everything. The ghost wasn't running away. He was running towards something, and the truth behind his nightly charge is darker, stranger, and far more heroic than anyone ever imagined. Oliver Bannister had spent 30 years teaching medieval history at Cambridge, a life of manuscripts, quiet libraries, and students who spoke of him with polite detachment. But when his wife Isabel died, the silence in his home became unbearable. Every corner whispered her absence. Every clock ticked like an accusation. He needed to escape, to find silence of a different kind, not the silence of grief, but the silence of nowhere. That's why he bought the cottage, a weathered Victorian gamekeeper's lodge perched on the eastern edge of a battlefield. The estate agent warned him, no neighbors for miles, no distractions, only hedgerows, damp walls, and soil that still carried the weight of history. To Oliver it was perfect. The leaky roof, the mold on the walls, the sagging kitchen, none of it mattered. Work would fill the hollow ache in his chest, but he couldn't ignore the way the estate agent kept checking the rear-view mirror as if something might be following them down that narrow country lane. She whispered that this ground had been no man's land where thousands had died in mud and fire. Some believed the land had never let them go. To Oliver that wasn't a warning. It was almost an invitation. But history, he was about to learn, does not stay buried. For the first few days, Oliver felt relief. He patched the roof, planned repairs, sat in silence broken only by the scrape of his pen. It was exactly what he wanted, until the third evening. He was outside, checking the chimney when it came. A shout, sharp, desperate, cutting across the still air like a blade. Oliver froze. The fields stretched out, empty. No wind, no storm, nothing that could carry such a sound, and then he heard it, footsteps, heavy boots pounding through mud. But the ground was dry, baked solid by weeks of late summer heat. Still the sound grew louder, then he saw it. A figure running across the field. At first it looked like a man, but no man moved like this. The strides were too long, too smooth, too fast. He wasn't running on the earth, he was gliding above it. Oliver raised his binoculars. His hands trembled so hard he nearly dropped them. Through the lenses, the figure came into focus, human. And yet not, the movements grotesque, the pace unnatural, and then just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The field lay still. Oliver lowered the binoculars, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had seen something impossible. And worse, he felt certain it had seen him too. The next night, Oliver waited. He told himself he wouldn't. But as the clock neared 6, he stood at the window. Watching, the sun dipped low. Shadows stretched, at first nothing, only the hush of the countryside. And then it came, that awful sound, the wet squelch of boots in mud that wasn't there. The runner emerged from the tree line. Now Oliver could see him more clearly, khaki wool uniform, rifle bouncing against his back, head bent at an unnatural angle as if the neck had been broken long ago. His stride wasn't just desperate, it was exhausted, hollow, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single run but from running forever. Halfway across the field, the figure stopped. For a heartbeat, maybe two, he stood motionless. Then slowly his head turned toward the cottage. Even through the distance, Oliver felt it a stare so heavy it struck like a blow. And then frost bloomed across the window in front of him. 5 fingerprints, etched into the glass. Oliver stumbled back, his chair clattering to the floor. By the time he looked again, the field was empty. But the frost remained. The ghost wasn't just appearing anymore. It was reaching out, and Oliver's dread sharpened into one terrible thought. What if this thing didn't just want to be seen? What if it wanted something from him? Haunted or not, Oliver was still a historian, and historians ask questions. He wrote to archives, scoured war diaries, contacted museums, but the real discovery wasn't in any record. It was in his own walls. One damp October afternoon, while tearing down stubborn wallpaper, his tools struck hollow. Behind the plaster, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a bundle, inside letters, dozens of them, written in careful, educated handwriting. Signed Private Christopher Hartwell, 24 years old, a schoolteacher before the war, Yorkshire Light Infantry. The letters were to his sister, Agnes. They spoke of mud, fear, and an anxiety more painful than death. Christopher confessed again and again that his greatest terror wasn't dying but failing, bringing shame to his name, being remembered as a coward. For the first time, Oliver felt the ghost had a voice, a soul, but the question remained. If Christopher Hartwell had been so thoughtful, so devoted, why was his spirit condemned to this endless run? The answer lay in history's cruel misreading. The military records told a different story. Christopher's body hadn't been found at the front, not near enemy lines, not in a charge. It was recovered behind the battlefield, southeast of the aid station, toward safety. The conclusion seemed clear. He hadn't advanced, he had retreated. For decades, locals repeated the same tale. The runner wasn't a hero, he was a coward, condemned to relive his shame night after night. Oliver's heart twisted as he read. The letters spoke of a man desperate not to dishonor his name, yet the world remembered him as the very thing he feared most. Was this the ghost's punishment, an eternity replaying disgrace? But something gnawed at Oliver. The haunting didn't feel like guilt. It felt like a message, too deliberate, too insistent. Each night the ghost grew clearer, his movements sharper. And then he began pointing, not at the field, not at the horizon, at the cottage, at the walls hiding what Oliver hadn't yet found. Behind another section of wall, Oliver's hands brushed against a second packet of letters, older, more fragile. And inside them the truth. These weren't calm reflections. They were last confessions, witness accounts. Scrawled in desperation, they told of the night of November 3rd, 1916, when a field hospital near the trenches caught fire. Wounded men screamed as the canvas burned. Flames lit the night sky, and Christopher Hartwell ran toward it. He pulled men out of the blaze, one after another, 7 in total, until a shell burst struck him down. Corporal Davies, one of the men he saved, finished Christopher's last letter himself. "Your brother saved my life." He wasn't a coward, he was a hero, we all saw it. Christopher's own dying words trembled across the page. "Tell father I stood firm. Tell him the Hartwells keep faith." For over a century, the world had seen only half the story. From the wrong angle, the ghost looked like retreat. But Christopher wasn't running away. He was running toward the fire. Oliver knew what had to be done. If Christopher's torment came from misunderstanding, only recognition could free him. So Oliver gathered every scrap of evidence, the letters, the records, the testimonies. He wrote articles, contacted military historians, submitted findings to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The truth spread. Local papers ran headlines. Regimental associations confirmed the story. Even Christopher's great niece wept as she learned her ancestor hadn't died in shame, but in sacrifice. And then came the night that changed everything. At 6:15, Oliver stood outside with witnesses, villagers, historians, and Christopher's descendant. The ghost emerged, but his stride was different, lighter, his face less tormented. Halfway across the field, he stopped, turned, and for the first time in more than a century smiled. He raised his hand in salute, held it for a long, still moment, and then faded, not abruptly, not in agony, but peacefully. The runner never appeared again. Christopher Hartwell's story had been twisted by time. Where people saw cowardice, there had been courage. Where they whispered shame, there had been sacrifice. He hadn't been trapped by failure. He had been trapped by misunderstanding. And only the truth could set him free, but the question lingers, how many other stories from history are the same? How many ghosts we think we know are actually something else entirely? Maybe the real horror is the haunting itself, but the way memory lies. So what do you think? Was Christopher Hartwell finally freed, or does the past never really rest? Let me know in the comments. Because sometimes the scariest ghosts aren't the ones that haunt us. They're the ones we've misunderstood. You made it through this story, but the night isn't over. More are waiting. Don't forget to follow Owl Stories and tell us in the comments if you'll be brave enough to listen in the dark again.